May the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts be pleasing in your sight, O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. If you go through that Deuteronomy passage today, you can underline the word love or the word heart several times. If you go through the word or through the Psalms today, you won't see necessarily love and heart with regards to what we think of as an emotion, but rather it's, I love God's law. Getting all excited about this God's law because it's getting that much closer to God. The Psalm is talking about God's love as in the Torah, as in, if anybody watched, instead of watching the Carolina-Virginia game last night, if you turned it to Indiana Jones and the Lost Ark, they're passionate about getting that Lost Ark, right? There's the enemy and there's the good guys, and they're all wrestling for the Ark of the Covenant, for God's law. The Psalm is saying, I love God's law that much, I'm going to wrestle even the enemies, even the devil, Satan, for it. And then Jesus in the gospel text today, it's all about love despite a whole bunch of statements on commands about thou shalt not. It's about how to live in a community. Yesterday, the day after Valentine's Day, thanks to Google, I got to discover it was Susan B. Anthony's birthday, February 15th. I know Susan B. Anthony's name and the coin, but I didn't know she was so filled with love for God, love for neighbor. All her work was done, love for God and love for neighbor. She was a Quaker Christian. She loved God, and therefore she loved neighbor. She was passionate about getting women the right to vote. In 1878, she was arrested for illegally voting. She was fined a great sum of money. It made the press. Apparently she had a good lawyer because she never paid a fine and she never went to jail or anything else. But then, about 20 years later, some people took up her calls about getting women the right to vote. And finally, 22 years after that, 42 years after she got arrested for illegally voting, 42 years, there's the Susan B. Anthony 19th Amendment that finally got passed. But she was also pretty passionate about the abolition of slavery as well, to abolish it, to love your neighbor as yourself. She changed the laws. She changed the rules. She changed the way our nation thought and acted to some extent about women and about African Americans. She even founded basically the ERA, Equal Rights Group at the time. ERA, Susan B. Anthony, laws, abolishment of things. Jesus is getting at that. He begins with a law today that says, you've heard it said, don't murder. Basically, then what he goes to is says, when God gave us this command, do you think the idea was that we would form some kind of community? Whether you're out in the wilderness waiting to go into the promised land or even at St. Mark's Lutheran Church. Do you think God thought we would form a community in which we constantly antagonize each other and hate each other and abuse each other and wound each other, and then at the last minute we refrain from murdering each other? I know some families like that, right? I know some other unhealthy situations like that. But Jesus says, of course not. When God's command was, you shall not murder, it meant everything, not just the act of murder, but down in your heart. How you think, how you act, how you behave. It's not just what your hands do, it's what your heart and mind and soul are doing. And the same thing, when he came up with, you shall not commit adultery. Oh, let me pause there. Let me go back. Two things in that statement about murder. One thing that we do pretty much every Sunday morning that comes out of that text. It says, if you have a grudge, if you have an issue against your brother or your sister, make sure you make up before you go see the judge. Or make sure you share a kiss of peace. That's why we share the peace of Christ before going up to the altar, before going up to the judgment throne, before going to communion. We share the peace of Christ before doing that based on that particular gospel text. We could share it right after the confession and forgiveness at the beginning of worship, but usually we wait until later. It's not just greeting and saying welcome to our neighbors and pew sitters. It's maybe that brother, that sister, that fellow pew sitter, that person behind you or in front of you that you are disagreeing with, and you're sharing a peace, a forgiveness, a statement of grace, so that we can go up as best we can to receive another statement of grace and forgiveness. The other part that says in verse 25 of today's text, come to terms quickly with your accuser while you are on the way. Come to terms quickly with your accuser while you're on the way in the New Revised Standard Version. But the Greek is not necessarily come to terms quickly with your accuser. The Greek is more like make sure you don't have an enemy. Make sure that you can make a friend here. So even if you are an enemy, while you're walking to the judge, see if you can become friends. And therefore, you won't even need to get to court. You won't even need to see the judge. Before you get to the front steps, you say, wow, I didn't realize that about you. Let's be friends. Friends and forgiveness is what Jesus is talking about there. He goes on then to talk about the commandment, you shall not commit adultery. When God gave us this command, Jesus is basically saying, do you think the idea was that we would form a community in which we constantly leer and lust after each other? Then we objectify and Google each other and just look around, wow, look. No, of course not, says Jesus. You shall not commit adultery means that we won't do any of that, and yet at the same time, Jesus knows in our hearts that we do sin in thought, word, and deed. We confessed that a while ago, that to God all hearts are open. So Jesus is basically saying, whoa, slow down. Pay attention to what's in your heart. Maybe give yourself a timeout occasionally. Give yourself a timeout or put yourself in quarantine occasionally. Take a deep breath. Ask God for God's help. And then to figure out a new way to live in community. Jesus frames the roots of adultery as offensive, lustful acts, objectification and pursuit, rather than enticement of someone. The remedy that Jesus recommends is not to have women to wear more modest clothing. He says, hey, men, look out. Take responsibility for your own hearts and your own dispositions and your own actions. And cut out whatever distorted ideas or habits you have that is causing you to sin. Then Jesus goes on about divorce. There's probably a statement in Deuteronomy about divorce, about people who divorced one wife and then married someone else and then divorced that wife and remarried that first wife. As weird as it was, that's probably what was going on. They could divorce and marry pretty quickly. There were different schools of thought, the house of Hillel and the house of Shammai, and you guys don't care about any of that. But basically, Jesus is walking a tightrope between the two Jewish houses, Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, about what they each thought about divorce. And Jesus is saying, don't divorce one just to marry the other one for a little bit and then to go back and remarry the first one. No. Make your, as he says later, let your yes be yes. Let your commitment be your commitment for the good of your family, for the good of your household, and for the good of the whole community. And then we get to the last one about swearing or taking oaths. Jesus basically says, if you have a good heart, if people can trust you and your word, then you don't need to be swearing either by heaven or by earth. No swearing is needed. No cursing is needed. Rather, what is needed is just your whole faith, your whole body, mind, soul, and spirit, loving God and loving neighbor. Those two laws, Jesus goes on to say in 17 chapters later, are what hang all the commandments. Love God and love neighbor. It's as simple as that, right? Moses wrestled with the same thing in Deuteronomy 30. He describes the law as a pathway of life, to love God and to love neighbor. The Israelites, he suggests that the Israelites have their hearts turned towards God and turned toward neighbor. And if they don't, then they're going to perish. They're going to die in the wilderness. Not that God punishes disobedience with death, but rather if we turn our hearts away from the law, turning our hearts away from God's love, we also turn away from friendship and respect, from kindness and responsibility and humility and integrity. At the heart, which are all things at the heart of the law. Jesus is getting at the heart. Moses is getting at the heart. And then if we can do these things, love God, love neighbor, then we choose life. We choose friendship. We choose kindness. We choose integrity. We choose humility. We choose respect. We choose responsibility. We choose grace and forgiveness. We choose life. And ultimately, we choose love. For Jesus and Moses alike, and for us, the law was a way to both love God and neighbor with all our heart. It's a good message for a couple days after Valentine's Day, right? Because God's great love for me makes our hearts go thump, and God's great love for us makes us want to jump. So jump up, and let's sing a not-so-crazy song about God's great love revealed in the commandments, revealed in the law, and then a little bit later on in worship, we're going to sing Joyful, Joyful, We Adore Thee, God of glory, Lord of love.